about any of the groups, any group you might like to start, anything you'd like to join in with. So Steve's the tall chap at the back, looking all serious. Thank you. So he'll be around during the end, and obviously you can talk to me, that's fine too. The other thing to bear in mind, if we've got elections coming up soon, so if you fancy, and I've got a list, if you fancy being either the chairperson of U3A, our U3A, one of the committee members anyway at all, if you fancy joining the newsletter team, now the newsletter is brilliant, and I don't know about you, I look forward to it arriving. I have a paper copy. I pay a bit extra, because I'm never going to read it off the screen. I mean, I know people do, but I just don't do that. Or you might want to be involved in the publicity. So obviously we like to let people know we're here, because don't you find you meet so many people, if you mention U3A, they just look blank. But there's hundreds and thousands of us, so how is that possible? Now, that must be down to something we're not doing right. Because if we're that hidden, I mean, you wouldn't mind, if you wanted to hide it, I bet you couldn't. But because we don't want to hide it, we're not doing a good job. So if you fancy being involved in the publicity, let me know as well. Or any questions at the end at all. So we're going to go with a talk for a while. Then we're going to have a cup of tea or coffee. There's stuff's being sent out in the lounge there. But any way you want to hang around, that's fine. But in the meantime, we've got a fabulous talk. So thank you for that. Now, if you got my note, you'll notice, and Tony hasn't heard this, that I got his name wrong. Okay? I have no idea why. I called you Ray. Now, why would I do that? I mean, he's not a Ray, is he? I mean, look at that, he's not a Ray at all. So basically, I'm going to let you introduce yourself because you'll do a much better job. But I think the content of this is going to be really educational for me, because all I know about from school is the Tudors and Stuarts. That's what they talk. I know, rubbish, isn't it? Useless. So if it's not the Tudors and Stuarts, then over to you.
Well, thank you very much, Sarah. That's one of the more unusual introductions I've received. My name is actually Tony, not Ray, but I hope I'm not going to disappoint you over the course of the next hour or so. So I want you to start by emptying your heads. Forget you're an amateur. I want you to join me. I want you to come to the Somme. It's 1916. It's the 1st of July. It's 10:30 in the morning. It's a fine morning, although there's been a lot of rain. There's a lot of mud around. But it's a fine morning now. A young Irish soldier called Private Andy Symington has marched forward into the forward attack trenches with his platoon. That means that his regiment, the 1st Battalion of the Royal Irish Fusiliers, is next to go over the top. Andy's standing there holding his rifle and a heavy bag of accessories on his back. Around him, some men faced with the prospect of imminent death are vomiting. Andy's eyes are trained on his lieutenant. He's looking anxiously and nervously at the lieutenant, waiting for that shrill whistle that means he goes over the top. He's literally next to do it. Let me freeze the story there. I'll come back to that. Andy Symington, Private Andy Symington, was my grandfather. When I was about, I should say I'm the oldest of 7 children from a very modest background in County Tyrone, Northern Ireland. We lived with our grandparents. I shared a bedroom with my grandfather for 15 years until he died. Still remember on a Sunday morning going upstairs fetching him up a cup of tea. I couldn't get him to wake up. And he died a couple of days later in hospital without regaining consciousness. Now, when I was about 11 or 12, I said to my grandfather, I said, "Grandad, one day I am going to write a book about you." And a degree in economics, a 40-year career in technology intervened. But eventually, 6 years ago, I retired. And that day dawned. It was time to settle the debt. So I went about researching what he'd done, where he was, looking at all the various records. And it took me 3 years to research and to write the book. And during the course of the research, something emerged which was completely unknown to our family, which I still myself find difficulty in believing. It is so incredible. I will reveal that to you as we get towards the end of this story. Some would say it's a divine intervention. Some would say it's the hand of God. I'll leave that to your judgment when we get there. It is a remarkable twist in the tale of our Somme story. So, anti-Semitism, it's a harrowing subject, the Somme. 1 million men lost, killed, friend and foe, in about 4.5 months, across an 18-mile stretch of eviscerated dirt. 200,000 Irishmen volunteered to fight for Britain during the First World War. There was never conscription in Ireland, they were all volunteers. 35,000 were killed. 6,000 of them actually came back insane. Their pension cards stamped insane. They spent the rest of their days incarcerated in institutions. If we look at the wider UK, those figures, 880,000 men were killed, lost their lives during World War I. And there were something like 85,000 men came back insane. And the truth is, God had not designed the human body to take that level of sustained shelling over such a long period. The First World War was the first of its kind. It wasn't just trench warfare; it was industrial warfare, and had never been seen before. About 150,000 Irishmen came back after the war in total, and of that number, these were now experienced fighting men. Of that number, it's been estimated that less than 60 actually were admitted into the nascent IRA and fought against the British during the Irish War of Independence. Andy Samington was one of those men. He joined the IRA in 1919 and fought for a couple of years against the British, primarily in Ulster in the north of Ireland. And when the Irish lost that war, they then simultaneously turned their guns on themselves. And that led into the Irish Civil War. So Andy Samington fought for Britain in the Battle of the Somme. He was in the British Army for 18 months before he got invalided out with a Civil War badge for wounds and shell shock. He then fought against the British for the IRA. And in the Civil War, he actually fought for Michael Collins' Free State Army against the IRA. So in 7 tumultuous years, 1916 to 1923, he saw a lot of bloodshed. The story we're focusing on today is the Somme. But also actually, if you look, we have a disc book, the second book in the... Can you still hear me okay? How's this go?
It's unplugged.
Dropped off.
I've dropped off. Looking at my man at the back there. Maybe something miraculous. That might work better, would it? How are we doing? Shall I use this? That's better, isn't it? I'll talk about to prevent feedback. I'll just switch this one off. So this is the Andy's exploits in the Irish War of Independence. It was actually published yesterday. I've got some books for sale if anybody's interested. Going very cheaply, cheaper than you can buy them on Amazon. I don't need the money, but think of my starving wife and children. So today's focus is the Somme. Yeah? Now the agenda we're going to run through quickly is I'm going to introduce you to Andy Samington, 24168, 1st Battalion Royal Irish Fusiliers. We're going to talk a little bit about the Unlucky Battalion. We're going to focus on the Somme. Sometimes this talk can get controversial, and it will. If it does, it will be around the lions led by donkeys. I came to the subject with no extra grind, but based on my research, I've formed some views, and I'll share those views with you. My views are no better than anybody else's, and I'm sure there'll be somebody in the audience who'll say, I've got a different view, and that's fine. We're allowed to differ. We'll talk a little bit about mutiny and shell shock, talk about mutiny and cover-up, talk about shell shock and living with it. One thing that I found doing the research was that despite all the deprivation and the detritus and the awful conditions that these men had to endure, every so often the sheer indomitability and the greatness of the human spirit would just burst through. So I just picked out 3 characters that epitomise that. And there were many, many more, but just for the sake of example, we'll talk about 3. And then finally, we'll talk about the legacy, what Andy left behind him. So the first thing that I struggled with was, why on earth did Andy Symington, 22-year-old Irishman, why did he volunteer to go to war? And it wasn't a popular thing to do in Ireland. Dr. Timothy Bowman had estimated that volunteering in Ireland was about 2 per 1,000 head of population. In the UK, it was about 8 per 1,000 head of population. So he wasn't following the crowd. He was actually going against the crowd to volunteer. He was a Catholic, Andy, so no particular loyalty to king or crown. He would not have heard that call. He was not responding, would not have responded to that type of call. And then I thought, well, perhaps it was financial. Maybe he was going for the money. Some people had said that there was no conscription in Ireland, but there was conscription by starvation. And some people were forced to go into the army to, for employment. That was not true of Andy Symington. He was a well-paid mill worker. He was a scutcher in a linen factory, earning 14 shillings a week. And the mathematicians amongst you, to take the country's shilling, 7 shillings a week, he was taking a 50% pay cut. I came to the conclusion that he was actually influenced by 2 of his brother-in-laws who are in the McLaughlins, who are in the picture behind me. Let me just resort to some technology. I can't possibly speak without one of these things. So, is that working? There you go. So these 2 McLaughlins. One was a career soldier. The other one joined up during the First World War. They were married to Andy's 2 older sisters. And I think they would have influenced him, and he would have joined, influenced by them, but primarily, I think Andy Symington was an adventurer. He wanted to go to France and Flanders to avoid the humdrum life of working in a mill, is the conclusion I've got to. Now, when I started out on this venture, one of the first things I did was go and visit the Royal Irish Fusiliers Museum, which is in Armagh. It's that building there. Royal Irish Fusiliers, that's their motif, their badge. They are, the 1st Battalion had a watchword. It was called Fochabalach, which is Gaelic for clear the way. And I went into the museum and I met a guy called Jonathan Maguire, who was their historian. I explained to Jonathan what I was trying to do, and he said, "Okay, Tony, would you happen to know which battalion your granddad fought in?" Now, at that stage, I'd already been to Kew Gardens. I'd already done some research. And I said, "Yeah, Jonathan, I do. He fought in the 1st Battalion." And as I said it, he sucked his breath in through his teeth. He said, the unlucky one. And the truth it was that the 1st Battalion, the Royal Irish Fusiliers as a regiment, raised 14 battalions in the First World War. They lost in total just over 3,000 men across those 14 battalions. The 1st Battalion lost almost 1,100 men. They bore the brunt of the losses for the entire regiment. They saw the heaviest of the fighting. And for whatever reason, they seemed to be consistently in the right place at the wrong time. It was an unlucky battalion because it suffered 83% casualties. Now, 83% casualties where a casualty is either dead or seriously wounded. And each new recruit, on average, suffered 3 wounds. And so it was very, very much a beleaguered battalion, one that paid in blood. On the other side of the ledger, Jonathan Maguire had estimated that a man like my grandfather, who'd been around for a year in the trenches, would have killed at least 50 men. Some killed many more than that. So there's no doubt Andy Symington, my grandfather, had blood on his hands. That was what they had to do. Now there's a story, one of the stories that my grandfather told was he was lying wounded in no man's land, and at that time, the most beleaguered job in the British Army. Anybody hazard a guess? What was the worst job? Highest casualty rate? Correct. Stretcher bearers. The Germans shot our stretcher bearers on sight, and we did the same to them. By 1916, there wasn't a lot of chivalry left on offer on the Western Front. Now, if the stretcher bearers came out at all, they would only pick up officers. And my granddad tells a story. He was lying with some of his mates, varying degrees of woundedness. Stretcher bearer came out, picked up an officer, and as they were carting the officer off, he said, pick up Symington, he's a good one. Pick up Symington, he's a good one. And that act of, call it benevolent discrimination, was something that it saved my grandfather's life, but it did so at the cost, the opportunity cost, of bearing the guilt of the survivor, something he bore for the rest of his life. And I can still see him now, staring into the mid-distance, he would prone to fits of intense melancholy. And he would sit there, revolving his thumbs, staring, and you knew do not interfere, let that play itself out. And that was part of the guilt of the survivor. There's a lovely church down in Chalfont St Giles, I'm sure somebody will know it, but down there the organist from 1905 to 1916 was a man called James Mead. He was a stretcher bearer, and he was also a conscientious objector, as a lot of the stretcher bearers were. There's a lovely plaque to James Mead in Chalfont St Giles Church. But he could not bring himself to raise an arm against his fellow man, but he wanted to do his bit. So he joined as a stretcher bearer and was killed actually in 1918, very sadly. As many of them, as I say, many of them were. By the end of the war, the Fawkes, as they were called, the 1st Battalion Royal Irish Fusiliers, that name was as revered as the Diehards or the Buffs or any other regiment that had actually made its name by the blood and the sacrifice that they had undergone. So, back to the first day of the Battle of the Somme. It's due to take place 2 days before, 48 hours earlier. But even though it's July, the weather was so wretched that they had to postpone it. The day itself was preceded by a 4-day bombardment where the British laid down, it's estimated, 1.75 million shells across an 18-mile stretch of trench. Now, let me just try and put that into some sort of perspective for you. 18 miles is roughly, if we took a line from Gerrard's Cross through Amersham up to Wendover, along the 413, that is about 18 miles. 1.75 million bombs fired across the A413. You can start to understand the level of devastation that would have caused. One of the best books I've ever read on the First World War was by a guy called Adam Hochschild. To End All Wars, it's called. In that book, he estimated that during the course of the 4 years of the First World War, both sides exchanged 700 million bombs, 700 million munitions, at least 10% of which did not explode. So again, the mathematicians, quick as a flash, that means 70 million bombs, 70 million unexploded bombs in France and Flanders. And that is why ever since 1918, someone has lost their lives due to a World War I munition exploding. Every year since. There are tracts of land today which are still completely segregated. You're not allowed to go near them, partly because of the bombs, but also because of where gas was used. The arsenic levels are like 10,000 times above what would normally be expected. Tracts of lands that they'll never see human habitation again. So, at 7:28 on the morning of the attack, the British had actually tunnelled in using miners that laid a lot of underground landmine bombs. And at 7:28 they were due to be detonated, and at 7:30 it was time to go over the top. What ensued was it was the worst day in the history of the British Army. There has never been so much bloodshed experienced before or since. On average across the line, they had to advance 375 yards to engage with the enemy. Their plan was to take the first line trenches, then take the Schwaben Redoubt, which was a very heavily fortified second line of trenches, and then motor on up the hill and take the Grand Corsaire Ridge. It was a plan that was conceived by General Haig and by Joffre, his French equivalent. They had a complex signalling system, so you can imagine regiment after regiment after regiment going over the top. Yeah, and how do you actually know what's actually happening? So one of the signalling mechanisms was to use a white light, and if you saw 3 white lights, that means my objectives have been achieved. And if you saw 1 white light, it meant I'm held up by barbed wire. And in the confusion and with everything going on, the bombs and the noise and the shooting and everything else, often the single white lights looked like 3 white lights. So although the men were actually snagged in barbed wire and hadn't got anywhere near their objectives, the next wave came in behind them, making it easier for them to be shot by the Germans. So, as I said, the worst day in the history of the British Army. Andy Symington, for him, he was lucky because that shrill whistle from his lieutenant never actually came. It should have, at 10:35, they got a call from High Command saying, enough, call her off. Others were not as lucky as Andy Symington. There were 19,240 men killed in the space of 3 hours. Another 57,000 wounded. 8th Corps, which is the corps that Andy Symington was in, lost 14,500 men killed. The 36th Ulster Division, which spearheaded the attack, they actually lost 2,000 men killed in that first advance and over 3,000 wounded. So it was bloodshed on an unparalleled scale. What actually then happened was that the wounded lay in no man's land for 4 days. It wasn't until the 5th of July that people could actually, stretcher bearers could come out under no fire and retrieve the wounded and the dying. Now, when I was writing the book, one of the things that I was keen to try and achieve was I didn't want it to be a chronology. They did this and then they recruited over there and then they went for training here. You need to do all that research so you understand the structure. That gives you the bones. But what I really wanted to put on the bones was, what was it like for a human being? What was it like for a man to serve in a trench under those conditions? And again, if you can empty your minds, imagine, it's the 2nd of July, it's the day after the attack. And all those, the wounded and the dead are still, in varying degrees, are still lying littered across the front. So the day after, most torturous of all, sound. The sound of wailing wounded drifting in from no man's land. Too dangerous to reach them after the frenzy, they were left to lie, beg and cry. Many called for their mothers as their life ebbed into the shell holes and they made the lonely transition from son to statistic. Others would scream in agony. Such was the aggregation of noises like a packed football stadium. It was difficult to pick out individual sounds as the cacophony synthesized into a single unearthly whine. An eerie, unsettling sound, persisting before dwindling into the chalk of the Somme and the silence of eternity. Field Marshal Sir Douglas Haig, his take the day after the Somme was that losses of 19,000 cannot be considered severe. We've lost 19,000 men, but that's not severe considering the amount of line that we were attacking, the 18 miles. Now the two gentlemen underneath there are two German generals. That's Hindenburg on the left and Ludendorff beside him on his left. Ludendorff actually coined the phrase, lions led by donkeys. And what he said was, and I'm quoting, "The English generals are wanting in strategy. we would have no chance if they possessed as much science as their officers and men have of bravery and courage. As their officers and men have of bravery and courage. They are lions led by donkeys. And that's a picture of the World War generals. They're not all there. There's a good few of them there. It's by John Singer Sargent. Hangs in the National Portrait Gallery. And the first time I saw it, it struck me immediately. These are basically a lot of fairly old men in riding breeches, carrying riding crops and swords. They were from the same sliver of society. The landed, the wealthy, public school educated, taught with educated in the tired teachings of Sandhurst. They were totally ill-equipped to deal with an industrial war. Their expertise and everything that knew and how to win battles came from the wide open plains of Transvaal and South Africa. They'd never had any understanding of what it took to win an industrial war like this one. Now, the other thing that struck me was this complete lack of diversity in that they're all from the same sliver of society, as I've said. Yeah? So consequently, when Percy French, who led the army for 2 years until he suffered incredible losses at the Battle of Loos, he then was replaced by French at the end of 1915. But replacing one with the other made no difference because they came from exactly the same philosophies, the same type of approach to life, reinforced by all their colleagues who all had held the same views. No inclusion, no diversity. Haig's strategy, and I'm using the word loosely, was to concentrate everything on the Western Front. So he ignored Turkey, Austria, Hungary, Bulgaria, brought everything onto the Western Front. That gave him in excess of 1 million men, 1 million soldiers across 38 divisions, and gave him, crucially, numerical superiority on the Western Front. And his strategy then was one of attrition. We will wear them down, and eventually, because we've got more men than them, we will win the war. Part of that attrition was to dominate no man's land. So every platoon commander, all the way along the line, had strict orders. You must be aggressive, you must dominate no man's land. And that's why a lot of the fighting was actually done in trench raids done after dark in the evenings. No man's land really came alive once it got dark. Now, I said I came to this with no axe to grind, and that is true. I now have quite a strong axe to grind. I've got strong views. I'm going to share them with you. I don't want to offend anybody. I'll apologise in advance. As I say, we've all entitled to our opinions. In making the case that High Command was incompetent, Exhibit 1 is a gentleman called Sir Aylmer Hunter Weston. Now, Hunter Weston, previously on his CV, he led the 29th Division at Gallipoli. I don't know much about Gallipoli, but I do know Gallipoli equals disaster. He was so out of touch during that battle that he was relieved of his duties and sent home. While he was at home, he then somehow or other managed to get knighted and promoted. And he came back as Lieutenant General of the 8th Corps. So instead of running a division, he's now running a corps, 3 times the size. And maybe, 25,000 men? Maybe actually no more than that, 50,000 men. Haig described him in his diaries as a rank amateur. And in the 1st Battalion, my grandfather's battalion, in the battalion diary, 8th of July 1916, so 1 week after the disaster of the first day of the Somme, this guy came along, addressed the battalion, and, quote, made a stirring speech. Now, in that stirring speech, he said that, well, the enemy had expected our attack. They had concentrated their best forces against us, and of course we had the most difficult part of the line to attack, which he knew because it was uphill. The topography of the terrain didn't change in a week. However, our sacrifice, our attack, greatly assisted the troops further south. It was a very thinly veiled attempt